In the realm of the unconscious, there are signs far more dangerous than outward behavior signs that originate deep within the shadow, hidden behind masks of politeness and normalcy. When we speak of danger, we often look outside ourselves. But the most perilous threats, as Dr. Carl Jung warned, are born in the very soul of a person, often disguised as virtues, often overlooked by society, and almost always denied by the individual. Today, we descend into the interior world where Jung's psychology unveils its most haunting truth. There is a specific sign, a subtle pattern of being, that signals spiritual decay and psychic fragmentation. This sign is not always loud, but it is always present when a person has become disconnected from the self, enslaved to ego, and possessed by a false identity. Jung called it one of the gravest signs of unconscious possession, and it is more common than we dare to admit. In this lecture, I will explore what Jung identified as the most dangerous sign in a person, not merely to expose it, but to invite you into the deeper work of integration, confrontation, and ultimately, transformation. For if we fail to recognize this sign, we risk allowing it to grow unchecked within ourselves, silently sabotaging every effort at wholeness, until the psyche collapses under the weight of its own denial. Let us now begin that courageous journey. Inward. Carl Jung believed that one of the most dangerous conditions a person can fall into is the repression of the shadow, which he defined as the dark, unconscious aspects of the personality that the conscious ego does not recognize or accept. This repression is not merely a psychological flaw or an unfortunate habit, it is a critical fracture in the journey toward wholeness. When someone represses their shadow, they effectively amputate part of their psyche, ignoring the very forces that, if integrated, would make them fully human. Jung did not see the shadow as purely evil or demonic. Rather, it is morally neutral. It contains the instincts, desires, and emotions that are deemed unacceptable by society or the individual's own values. But when these contents are denied expression or integration, they do not disappear. They retreat into the unconscious, where they fester, build energy, and eventually find ways to manifest in distorted, destructive, and often uncontrollable forms. A person who represses their shadow often presents a surface that is overly polished, highly agreeable, morally upstanding, or socially compliant. They seem to embody the ideals of what is considered good by collective standards. But Jung warned that such a person, while appearing harmless, might actually be among the most dangerous. Why? Because the parts of themselves they have deemed unworthy or shameful do not cease to exist. They simply operate from behind the scenes, influencing behavior, relationships, and decisions without the person ever realizing that their actions are being driven by forces they refuse to acknowledge. The repressed shadow becomes autonomous. It takes control, and the person becomes a puppet to the very parts of themselves they have tried to eliminate. In Jungian psychology, repression is not the same as resolution. To repress something is to push it out of conscious awareness, not to deal with it. What is repressed is not gone, it is simply buried. But unlike a body buried in the ground, which decays and disappears, the shadow grows stronger in the unconscious. It feeds on secrecy, denial, and fear. The longer it is unacknowledged, the more volatile it becomes, and because the person refuses to see it in themselves, they begin to project it onto others. They see others as selfish, arrogant, immoral, or dangerous, without realizing that these judgments are rooted in qualities they have not owned within themselves. This is where repression transforms from an inner issue into a societal danger. Entire communities, political movements, and religious groups can be built on collective shadow repression, leading to scapegoating, dehumanization, and violence. Jung observed that individuals who were unwilling to confront their shadow often developed a rigid and moralistic stance toward others. They became critical, judgmental, and emotionally inflexible. This behavior is a psychological defense mechanism. By focusing on the flaws and shadows of others, they avoid the terrifying task of facing their own. But this evasion comes at a cost. The unacknowledged shadow begins to manifest through physical illness, depression, anxiety, addiction, or obsessive behavior. It may also sabotage relationships, careers, and creative potential. The person becomes divided within, split between the persona they present to the world and the truth of who they are beneath that mask. In analytical psychology, this split is referred to as a psychic disintegration. When the conscious mind is no longer in communication with the unconscious, the individual loses access to their full energy. They become fatigued, uninspired, and internally conflicted. Jung believed that integration of the shadow was essential, not only for personal healing but for the development of the soul. Without it, a person lives a half-life, governed by fear of their own inner world. They become afraid to feel anger, afraid to acknowledge envy, afraid to confront desire or ambition. They censor their thoughts, suppress their instincts, and wear the mask of what society deems acceptable. But beneath that mask is a boiling undercurrent of unmet needs, buried traumas, and unfulfilled desires, all of which demand expression in one way or another. The repression of the shadow can lead to moments of inexplicable outbursts, moral contradictions, or sudden breakdowns that seem out of character. Jung emphasized that when we do not take responsibility for our shadow, it eventually erupts in ways we cannot control. A person who has spent their life projecting calmness and goodness may suddenly fall into scandal, addiction, or destructive relationships. These are not random lapses of judgment, they are the unconscious reclaiming its territory, demanding attention, and forcing the individual to confront the truth. But often, instead of heeding the call to integrate, people double down on their repression. They become more religious, more disciplined, more externally virtuous, while internally, the pressure continues to mount. The most dangerous aspect of shadow repression is not just the personal cost but the collective consequence. When leaders, influencers, or public figures are deeply repressed, they carry their unconscious into every decision they make. Their unresolved wounds and disowned traits become projected onto policies, cultural norms, and social structures. Jung observed this in the rise of authoritarian regimes, where leaders projected their own inner conflicts onto enemies and outsiders, justifying control, surveillance, and violence in the name of order or purity. This dynamic still plays out today, in families, institutions, and nations. The refusal to face one's inner darkness creates a world obsessed with controlling external darkness, which in truth is only a mirror of what lies within. To repress the shadow is to reject the path of individuation, the process Jung saw as the central aim of human life. Individuation involves integrating all parts of the psyche, not just the parts we like or that others approve of. It means facing the horror and beauty within, holding the tension of opposites, and becoming whole. But repression blocks this process. It keeps the person stuck in a false self, performing roles, chasing approval, and avoiding the transformative pain that leads to self-realization. Jung often warned that the shadow, if not integrated, will become the enemy of the soul. And the tragedy is that this enemy is not foreign, it is the very part of ourselves that, if embraced, could lead us into the fullness of who we were meant to be. This inner division, created by repression, is what Jung considered one of the greatest threats to both personal peace and cultural evolution. In the unconscious mind, everything we repress seeks reconciliation. The shadow is not simply a container of evil, it also contains creative potential, intuitive wisdom, emotional depth, and powerful energy. When we repress it, we cut ourselves off from those gifts. We become passive, conformist, and spiritually stagnant. Our choices are no longer free but conditioned by fear of discovering something undesirable within. The more we repress, the more we live in illusion. An illusion is the most fertile ground for self-deception, manipulation, and suffering. Jung's work calls us to a radical honesty, a courage to see not just the good but the grotesque, not just the noble but the petty, not just the light but the shadow. In doing so, we reclaim the power of our full humanity. We become less controlled by unconscious forces and more able to engage with the world from a place of depth and integrity. But the first step in that journey is the willingness to acknowledge that the shadow exists, not just in others, not just in history, but in us. Carl Jung warned that one of the most dangerous signs in a person is the presence of moral superiority that masks unconscious evil. He observed that the individuals who are most convinced of their righteousness are often the least aware of their own shadow. The sense of being morally superior creates an illusion of purity, but that very illusion blinds them to the darkness within. The danger does not lie in the mere act of believing one is good. It lies in the denial that one is capable of evil. Jung understood that the psyche is not made of light alone. It is a landscape filled with contradictions, containing both creative and destructive forces. The person who cannot admit the potential for darkness within themselves becomes a hostage to that darkness. The more they identify with the light, the more their shadow is denied, and the more powerful it becomes in the unconscious. Moral superiority often emerges as a defense mechanism when individuals are confronted with aspects of themselves that feel shameful, violent, jealous, or selfish. They cope by inflating their own virtue. They create a persona that is charitable, self-sacrificing, ethical, or spiritual. But this persona is not their whole truth. It is a mask, carefully curated, to hide from themselves and others what they cannot bear to acknowledge. The greater the need to appear morally upright, the more likely that a significant part of the self has been repressed. Jung emphasized that this internal division is not just psychologically unhealthy, it is spiritually dangerous. For the person begins to mistake the mask for the truth, the role for the self, the projection for reality. This kind of moral inflation is insidious, because it permits the person to act in harmful ways without self. They may criticize, condemn, or even attack others while believing they are doing what is right. They might enforce strict rules, shame others for perceived faults, or distance themselves from anyone who does not align with their standards, or while they are convinced they are standing for truth, righteousness, or justice. But Jung would ask, where is the shadow? What part of yourself have you buried beneath this righteousness? What do you not want to see? The more a person denies the possibility that their actions may be contaminated by unconscious motives, the more likely those motives are driving them without their awareness. This is why Jung considered moral superiority a deeply dangerous sign. It cloaks unconscious evil in the robes of goodness. This pattern can be seen in religious institutions, political movements, and even within families. The parent who punishes their child for their own good may be projecting their own unresolved rage. The religious leader who shames others for sin may be suppressing their own hidden desires. The activist who speaks of justice with cruelty may be acting out their own inner chaos. Jung saw that the unconscious is clever. It does not simply vanish when we ignore it. Instead, it copes our language, our beliefs, our sense of purpose. The unconscious can use even the highest ideals as vehicles for destruction when those ideals are not rooted in self. A person can fight for what is good in the world while perpetuating immense harm, simply because they have not examined their own shadow. One of the most alarming features of moral superiority is its immunity to criticism. A person who is morally inflated does not listen. They defend their views with intensity, because those views are not just beliefs, they are a structure that protects them from seeing themselves. Any challenge feels like a threat to their identity. They will rationalize harmful behavior, justify cruelty, and cling to ideological purity because the alternative, admitting fault, seeing their shadow, is too painful. Jung pointed out that the more identified one is with being good, the harder it becomes to engage in honest introspection. The ego becomes fragile, and any hint of self-criticism is met with denial or projection. Thus, a dangerous loop is formed. The more they deny their darkness, the more it controls them. The more it controls them, the more they must perform goodness to avoid facing the truth. Jung's work calls for the integration of opposites. He did not believe that people should abandon their values or stop striving for moral growth, but he insisted that true morality is impossible without self-knowledge. To become truly good, one must face the capacity for evil within. It is not enough to believe in virtue, we must be willing to encounter the forces in ourselves that oppose it. This is the path of individuation. It is not about becoming perfect, but about becoming whole. And wholeness includes the shadow. Jung wrote that no tree can grow to heaven unless its roots reach down to hell. This means that real transformation comes when we confront what is hidden, not when we deny it. The morally superior person often fears what will happen if they admit to imperfection. They think it will destroy their integrity, their identity, or their relationships. But Jung teaches that this fear is a barrier erected by the ego. In truth, the willingness to see one's own flaws, contradictions, and darkness is what opens the door to wisdom and compassion. Only by confronting the shadow can we become capable of real love, because only then are we free from the unconscious need to control, judge, or dominate others in the name of righteousness. A person who has integrated their shadow does not need to appear good. They are free to be real, and from that authenticity flows a deeper kind of moral clarity. When moral superiority becomes a performance, it disconnects the person from empathy. They begin to view others not as fellow human beings, but as categories: the righteous and the wicked, the enlightened and the ignorant, the pure and the impure. This binary thinking is the hallmark of shadow repression. It prevents dialogue, shuts down growth, and fuels conflict. Jung saw this dynamic at work in collective psychology as well. Nations, movements, and ideologies can fall into the same trap. When a group believes it is morally superior, it becomes blind to its own capacity for violence and cruelty. History is full of examples where atrocities were committed not by people who thought they were evil, but by people convinced they were doing good. The solution is not to abandon morality, but to deepen it. Jung proposed that each person must turn inward and confront their own moral contradictions. This involves accepting that the potential for cruelty, envy, pride, lust, and deception exists in all of us. It means taking responsibility for our projections, questioning our motives, and recognizing that our judgments of others may be mirrors reflecting what we refuse to see in ourselves. It is painful work, but it is also liberating, because when we make peace with our shadow, we become less reactive, less defensive, and more capable of discernment. We stop needing to appear good and begin seeking what is true. Jung's perspective challenges us to replace pride with humility, to admit that we are complex, that our motives are rarely pure, and that every act of righteousness must be accompanied by a willingness to examine the unconscious forces at play. He believed that the shadow was not the enemy, it was the path. The very place we fear is the place that holds the key to integration. And when we deny the shadow under the illusion of moral superiority, we cut ourselves off from the very transformation we claim to desire. Carl Jung identified the persona as the social mask we wear to navigate the expectations of society, a necessary construct that allows us to function within cultural norms and interpersonal roles. However, he warned that when a person identifies solely with the persona, when the mask becomes mistaken for the self, a deep psychological danger emerges. The persona, though essential, is not the true self. It is a compromise between the individual and the world, shaped by external demands, rather than internal truth. The danger lies in the over-identification with this external identity, leading to a shallow existence where the deeper parts of the psyche are denied, suppressed, or forgotten altogether. The individual becomes a reflection of what others expect them to be, rather than an authentic expression of their own inner reality. This over-identification with the persona creates a split within the psyche. The conscious self becomes consumed with maintaining appearances, performance, and conformity, while the unconscious self grows increasingly neglected and chaotic. Jung emphasized that the unconscious is not inert, is alive, dynamic, and seeking expression. When the deeper layers of the psyche are ignored, they do not disappear. Instead, they begin to manifest in subtle or destructive ways, pulling at the edges of the carefully maintained persona. Dreams become disturbing. Emotions become unpredictable. Behaviors emerge that seem out of character. The unconscious resists being silenced, and the more rigidly the persona is held, the more pressure builds within the psyche. A person who lives only through their persona is often praised by society. They are seen as successful, respectable, agreeable, or virtuous. They fulfill roles with apparent ease, whether as professionals, leaders, parents, or community figures. But beneath the surface, their inner world is often marked by emptiness, anxiety, or confusion. They may not know who they truly are when the roles fall away. Jung saw this as a profound existential crisis. A person can become a stranger to themselves, alienated from their own instincts, values, and desires. The persona gives them a place in the external world, but it robs them of access to their internal world. They become actors in a play they did not write, reciting lines that were handed to them by family, culture, religion, or tradition. The longer a person maintains this identification with the persona, the more fragile their sense of self becomes. They may experience a deep fear of failure, because any crack in the mask threatens to expose the void beneath. They may avoid conflict at all costs, because disagreement could shatter the illusion of harmony they are desperately trying to preserve. They may feel intense pressure to meet expectations, driven by the fear that if they are truly seen, they will be rejected. Jung believed that this fear is rooted in the knowledge of an unconscious that the persona is a facade, and while the world may applaud the performance, the soul longs for authenticity. This longing, if ignored, turns into psychological suffering. Living only through the persona also leads to a profound repression of the shadow. The parts of the self that do not align with the persona, anger, desire, grief, creativity, rebellion, are pushed into the unconscious. But Jung taught that the shadow contains not only what is negative, but also what is vital and true. By rejecting these elements, the person becomes psychologically impoverished. They lose touch with the raw, instinctual energy that gives life depth and meaning. They may become passive, compliant, or emotionally flat. Relationships suffer, because true intimacy requires vulnerability, and the persona cannot be vulnerable. It is a defense, not a doorway. And so, the individual becomes increasingly isolated. Even in the midst of social success, the persona can also become a prison. As the individual continues to play their role, they may begin to feel trapped by the very identity they created. The doctor who must always be competent, the pastor who must always be holy, the parent who must always be selfless. These personas create an impossible standard. The pressure to maintain the image can lead to burnout, resentment, or breakdown. Jung saw this collapse not as a failure, but as a potential turning point. When the persona cracks, the unconscious is finally allowed to surface. The individual is forced to confront what lies beneath the mask, and this confrontation, though painful, opens the door to transformation. One of the most dangerous aspects of identifying solely with a persona is the inability to engage in genuine, inner work. The persona resists introspection, because introspection threatens its stability. It avoids discomfort, avoids shadow, avoids contradiction. But Jung insisted that true psychological and spiritual growth requires the willingness to enter into the unknown, to face what is uncomfortable, to question what has been assumed. The persona cannot do this. It is not designed for it. Only the self, the totality of the conscious and unconscious mind, can engage in the process of individuation. And individuation requires the dismantling of the false self. Jung was not advocating the destruction of the persona. He recognized its utility and necessity in navigating the world. But he warned against confusing the mask with the face. The goal is not to abandon the persona, but to hold it loosely, to use it as a tool rather than a definition. When a person can say, "This is the role I play, but it is not the whole of who I am," they are beginning to detach from identification and move toward integration. They are able to acknowledge the persona without becoming imprisoned by it. Path away from persona identification begins with honesty. It requires asking difficult questions. Who am I when no one is watching? What do I feel when I stop trying to please others? What parts of myself have I hidden in order to be accepted? This kind of inquiry is disruptive. It shakes the foundation of the ego, but Jung believed that this disruption is sacred. It is the first step in the journey toward the self. And the self is not a role, it is a living, breathing reality that transcends all performance. When the persona dominates, the individual becomes disconnected from their inner guidance. They may struggle with decision-making, constantly looking to others for approval. They may feel spiritually stagnant, unable to access intuition or inspiration. Jung observed that the soul cannot speak through the persona, it speaks through dreams, through the body, through emotional truth. These messages are often inconvenient for the persona, which prefers control and predictability. But the soul does not care about appearances. It seeks authenticity, wholeness, and depth. Ignoring its call leads to symptoms, restlessness, depression, addiction, or a sense that life lacks meaning. In relationships, the identification with the persona creates distance. The individual may become performative, always trying to impress, to entertain, to maintain a certain image. But this undermines connection. Real love requires vulnerability, and vulnerability cannot exist behind a mask. The persona is always concerned with how it is being perceived. It cannot reveal weakness, confusion, or fear. But these very qualities, when expressed honestly, are what make intimacy possible. The more a person hides behind the persona, the more alone they feel, even if they are surrounded by people. Jung believed that midlife was often the time when the persona began to unravel. The roles that once gave life structure, career, family, status, no longer satisfied the deeper longings of the soul. This period, often marked by crisis, is also a gateway. It is the moment when the self begins to emerge, demanding to be seen. The individual is faced with a choice: continue the performance, or begin the inward journey. The latter path is uncertain, often lonely, and filled with challenge. But it is also the only path to freedom, to authenticity, and to a life that is truly one's own. Carl Jung regarded projection as one of the most subtle and dangerous mechanisms of the psyche, a defense that allows the ego to protect itself from truths it is unwilling to face. In the process of projection, a person discerns qualities within themselves and unconsciously attributes them to others. These qualities may be positive or negative, but in the most dangerous forms, they are aspects of the shadow, those darker, repressed parts of the self that contradict the persona. Jung observed that the more unconscious a person is, the more they project, and the more they project, the less they know themselves. Projection becomes a veil that covers not only the other person, but also obscures the inner reality of the one doing the projecting. It is a barrier to self-awareness, and a primary source of interpersonal conflict, misunderstanding, and judgment. When someone projects their shadow onto another, they see in that person what they cannot or will not see in themselves. The angry person accuses others of hostility. The deceitful person suspects everyone around them of dishonesty. The envious person feels attacked by the supposed jealousy of others. What makes projection dangerous is that it feels absolutely real. The individual does not recognize the emotion or judgment as coming from within, they are convinced that it originates outside of them. This conviction leads them to react defensively, aggressively, or with condemnation, believing they are responding to an external threat when, in truth, they are encountering a reflection of their own inner world. Jung emphasized that projection is not something reserved for the emotionally unstable or mentally illiterate, it is a universal psychological process. Every human being projects to some extent. It is a natural function of consciousness, especially in early development, but the danger arises when projection becomes chronic, unconscious, and unexamined. The more a person refuses to engage with their own inner material, the more their reality becomes distorted by projections. They lose the ability to discern truth from illusion, relationship from fantasy, and self from other. The world becomes populated by enemies, threats, and caricatures, all bearing the features of the repressed self. In relationships, projection is often the root of conflict and disconnection. Partners, friends, or family members begin to experience each other not as they are, but as containers for disowned feelings, unresolved trauma, or unmet needs. A partner who cannot face their own need for control may accuse the other of being manipulative. A parent who cannot admit to their own sense of failure may judge their child harshly for not meeting expectations. The person projecting is unaware that they are seeing a reflection. They believe they are seeing truth, and in that belief, they justify actions that are often harmful: criticism, withdrawal, punishment, or emotional disengagement. What begins as an internal struggle becomes a relational wound. Projection also plays a powerful role in society. Jung observed how groups, communities, and nations project their collective shadow onto others. Political opponents, racial or ethnic groups, religious outsiders, or even abstract concepts like the enemy become vessels for all that a society cannot bear to face in itself. This collective projection leads to prejudice, dehumanization, and violence. The more energy a culture devotes to projecting its darkness outward, the more blind it becomes to its own capacity for evil. This blindness can fuel atrocities, all under the illusion of moral justification. Jung understood that, without conscious engagement with the shadow, civilization itself remains in danger of destroying what it does not understand. The tragedy of projection is that it cuts a person off from their own growth. The qualities they project, anger, fear, ambition, sensuality, vulnerability, are not inherently negative. In many cases, they are essential parts of the psyche that must be integrated for the person to become whole. But because these qualities do not fit the image the ego wants to maintain, they are exiled. And once exiled, they return in the form of judgment and emotional reaction. Every time a person reacts intensely to someone else's behavior, there is an opportunity to look inward. What part of myself am I seeing? What emotion is being stirred? And where does it originate within me? These are the questions that begin to dissolve the projection and bring the shadow into conscious awareness. Jung taught that every projection contains a gift, if we are willing to retrieve it. By withdrawing projections, we reclaim the parts of ourselves we had abandoned. The anger we saw in another may point to our own need to set boundaries. The arrogance we criticized might reveal our suppressed desire for confidence. The chaos we feared could be a sign that we have ignored our own creativity. Projection is not only a defense, it is also a map. It shows us where we are incomplete, where we have work to do, and where our healing lies. But to read the map, we must take responsibility for our inner life. The process of withdrawing projection is difficult. It requires humility, self-honesty, and emotional courage. It often feels safer to believe that others are the problem, that the fault lies outside of us. But this safety is an illusion. When we live in projection, we are not free. We are bound to a reactive pattern that limits our choices and distorts our reality. We cannot change what we do not own, and we cannot grow if we are always looking outward instead of inward. Jung believed that the path to individuation, the process of becoming whole, depends on our willingness to reclaim what we have projected. This is the journey of self-possession, of becoming responsible for the full range of our emotions, desires, and behaviors. Projection is particularly difficult to recognize because it operates unconsciously. The ego is structured to defend itself, and projection is one of its most effective tools. It allows the person to feel good about themselves while disowning what is uncomfortable. But this temporary relief comes at a cost. Over time, the person becomes increasingly reactive, judgmental, and disconnected from their authentic self. They may begin to feel victimized by life, unable to understand why relationships fall apart, why conflict seems to follow them, or why they feel unfulfilled. The answer lies in the shadow, the part of themselves they have refused to face. In Jung's view, healing begins when we stop asking, "Why is this happening to me?" and start asking, "What is this revealing about me?" This shift in perspective turns projection into a tool for insight. Every irritation, every judgment, every emotional charge becomes an invitation to examine what part of the self is being stirred. This is not to say that others are never responsible for harm or wrongdoing. Jung did not advocate moral relativism. Rather, he insisted that our emotional reactions are always worth exploring, because they point to our inner landscape. When we learn to track our projections, we begin to see patterns. We begin to recognize the recurring figures in our inner world, the archetypes and complexes that shape our perception. Ultimately, projection keeps us from love. Not only love for others, but love for ourselves. It maintains the illusion of separation, self and other, good and bad, worthy and unworthy. It reinforces dualities that fragment the soul. Jung believed that integration dissolves these false divisions. As we reclaim the parts of ourselves we have cast out, we become more compassionate, more grounded, and more whole. We stop needing to project because we are no longer afraid of what we might find within. We develop a deeper trust in our own humanity, and in the humanity of others. This is the essence of Jung's psychological and spiritual vision, a journey toward unity, not through perfection, but through the courageous encounter with all that we are. Carl Jung emphasized that one of the greatest psychological dangers in a person is the ego's resistance to individuation and inner truth. Individuation is the process by which a person becomes who they truly are, distinct from the collective identity, beyond the masks of the persona, and free from the domination of unconscious forces. It is not merely a path of self-improvement or success, but a profound journey inward toward wholeness. The ego, however, is not naturally inclined to embark on this journey. It prefers control, predictability, and safety. It clings to the known, the accepted, and the approved. Jung observed that the ego fears change because change threatens its authority. When faced with a call to individuation, the ego often responds with denial, avoidance, rationalization, or projection. This resistance is subtle and cunning, often disguised as responsibility, morality, or even humility. The ego resists inner truth because inner truth is destabilizing. It demands honesty, vulnerability, and the dismantling of illusions. To discover one's true self is to face the parts that have been buried, silenced, or disowned. It is to challenge inherited beliefs, cultural conditioning, and personal defenses. The ego has spent years, sometimes a lifetime, constructing a version of self that is socially acceptable, functional, and safe. But the true self does not conform to safety. It demands authenticity, and authenticity is often uncomfortable. It breaks the mold. It refuses to live according to expectations. Jung warned that when the ego becomes rigid, it traps the individual in a false life, where actions are dictated not by inner guidance but by fear, guilt, and the desire to please or conform. This resistance shows up in many forms. A person may avoid solitude, because in stillness the deeper self begins to speak. They may reject therapy or spiritual practice, dismissing it as unnecessary or indulgent, because they unconsciously fear what they might discover. They may resist dreams or symbolic material that emerge from the unconscious, dismissing them as meaningless or irrelevant. Jung understood that this resistance is not always conscious. The ego does not say, "I do not want to grow." Instead, it says, "I don't have time," or "That's not practical," or "I'm fine the way I am." These statements mask a deeper fear, the fear of losing control, of confronting pain, of surrendering to something greater than the ego itself. One of the key aspects of Jung's psychology is the recognition that the ego is not the whole of the psyche. It is only a small part, though it often believes itself to be everything. The unconscious is far larger, richer, and more powerful. The ego fears this power because it cannot control it. Dreams, intuitions, synchronicities, and emotional eruptions are reminders that something beyond the ego is at work. The ego may feel threatened by these phenomena, seeing them as irrational or disruptive. But for Jung, these are signs that the deeper self is calling. They are invitations to listen, to feel, to follow the thread into the unknown. The refusal to heed these signs creates inner conflict, emotional stagnation, and spiritual disconnection. Ego's resistance is not inherently evil, it is often a response to pain. Many people have experienced trauma, rejection, or abandonment that caused them to build strong defenses. The ego learned to protect them, to manage the world, to ensure survival. But what once protected them now becomes a barrier. The ego continues to operate from fear even when the original threat is gone. It clings to control because it does not trust the deeper self. It fears that surrendering to inner truth will result in chaos, loss, or exposure. Jung taught that part of the work of individuation is to build a relationship between the ego and the self, a higher organizing principle that holds the totality of the psyche. The ego must come to understand that it is not losing control, but being guided by something wiser and more whole. Resistance to individuation can also manifest as chronic busyness or external focus. People fill their lives with work, entertainment, obligations, and noise to avoid the silence in which the soul speaks. They become addicted to achievement or productivity, measuring their worth by external standards. The ego thrives in this environment because it allows the person to avoid their inner life. But eventually, something breaks. A crisis, illness, loss, or inexplicable emptiness interrupts the performance. This rupture, painful as it may be, is often the beginning of individuation. The ego can no longer hold the structure together, and the self begins to emerge through the cracks. Jung noted that many people resist individuation because it demands a descent. It is not a linear ascent into light, but a spiral inward, often passing through shadow, grief, confusion, and despair. The ego, with its preference for clarity and control, wants a straight path. It wants to improve, to succeed, to be better. But the soul is not interested in perfection, it seeks wholeness. And wholeness includes the broken, the lost, the wounded, the hidden. The ego resists because it does not want to revisit pain. It fears that opening those doors will unleash something unbearable. But what is unbearable is not the truth, it is the effort to keep the truth buried. Jung believes that facing the truth of one's own psyche, however dark or painful, is the gateway to healing. This resistance is reinforced by culture. Most societies do not encourage individuation. They reward conformity, obedience, and external success. The person who steps out of line, who questions authority, who follows their inner voice, is often seen as rebellious, impractical, or even dangerous. The ego absorbs these messages and internalizes the fear of being different. It aligns itself with collective norms and silences the unique call of the soul. Jung urged individuals to break free from the collective unconscious, to become conscious of their own path, to stop living someone else's story. This requires courage, because the path of individuation is often lonely. It involves saying no to what is popular and yes to what is true. The resistance to inner truth also shows up in the rational mind. Logic, intellect, and analysis are valuable tools, but the ego often hides behind them to avoid emotional or symbolic work. It dismisses dreams, resists vulnerability, and denies the mystery of the psyche. Jung saw that truth is not always logical, it is symbolic, paradoxical, and intuitive. The ego wants certainty, but inner truth is often ambiguous. The self speaks through images, metaphors, and archetypes, requiring the ego to surrender its need for control. This surrender is not weakness, it is the beginning of wisdom. When the ego finally softens, when it begins to trust the deeper self, a transformation begins. The person starts to feel aligned, not just with themselves, but with something greater. Life begins to feel meaningful. Choices become clearer, not because they are easy, but because they resonate with inner truth. Jung called this alignment the realization of the self. It is not about becoming someone else, it is about becoming who you already are at the deepest level. But this realization is only possible when the ego stops resisting, when it listens instead of controlling, follows instead of directing, serves instead of dominating. The danger lies in the ego's belief that it can live the entire life of a person, that it knows best, that it must be in charge, that it cannot be questioned. This illusion leads to suffering. The person feels disconnected, anxious, empty, or restless, unable to articulate why. They may succeed outwardly but feel lost inwardly. They may fulfill every role yet feel as if they have not truly lived. Jung saw this as the crisis of the modern individual, cut off from the soul, ruled by the ego, trapped in a life that is not their own. The solution is not to destroy the ego but to put it in right relationship with the self, to recognize that the ego is a servant, not a master, that real freedom comes not from domination, but from integration, that truth is not something we invent, but something we remember, something we uncover, something we already carry within. Carl Jung taught that much of what drives human behavior does not originate in the conscious mind, but from patterns buried deep within the unconscious, often passed down through generations. These inherited patterns, what Jung called complexes, or archetypal imprints, are formed not only through personal experience, but also through the emotional, psychological, and even spiritual burdens of those who came before us. When these patterns remain unconscious, they express themselves through compulsive behaviors, repeating cycles, and emotional triggers that the individual cannot explain. Jung warned that the unconscious compulsion to repeat inherited trauma patterns is one of the most dangerous signs in a person's inner life, precisely because the individual believes they are making free choices when in fact they are being unconsciously directed by a story that is not entirely their own. These trauma patterns often originate in early childhood but are rooted even deeper in ancestral or familial history. A child who grows up with emotionally unavailable parents, for example, may unconsciously seek relationships that recreate that very dynamic, drawn to what is familiar even if it is painful. A person whose ancestors endured war, poverty, or systemic oppression may find themselves gripped by fear, scarcity, or mistrust even when their outer circumstances do not warrant such responses. These reactions are not based on logic, they are imprints in the psyche, encoded through memory, emotion, and generational transmission. Jung saw that these inherited patterns often take the form of complexes, clusters of emotionally charged ideas that have split off from consciousness. These complexes behave like autonomous personalities within the psyche, complete with their own will, agenda, and energy. They are not evil in themselves, but when left unexamined, they can take control of the personality, dictating how a person sees the world and responds to it. What makes these inherited trauma patterns so dangerous is their invisibility. Because they are unconscious, they feel natural. The person believes that this is just how life is, how relationships work, how success or failure unfolds. They do not realize that they are reenacting an unresolved story. Jung emphasized that, until the unconscious is made conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. These trauma patterns shape a person's beliefs, behaviors, and emotional reactions. They influence career choices, romantic partners, parenting styles, and even health. The person may feel trapped in cycles they cannot break, choosing emotionally distant partners, sabotaging opportunities, repeating the emotional tone of their childhood home, or carrying guilt, shame, or anxiety that does not belong to them personally but comes from an unspoken family narrative. Often, these patterns are passed down not through explicit teaching, but through emotional atmosphere. A child may not be told to fear intimacy, but they absorb it through the behavior of emotionally distant parents. They may not be taught that anger is dangerous, but they internalize it from a family that suppresses conflict. They inherit the silence, the tension, the unspoken rules. These become the blueprint for their own emotional life. Jung understood that these patterns are not only psychological, they are also energetic. They live in the psyche as a kind of emotional resonance, vibrating below the level of conscious awareness, drawing experiences that match the inner script. The repetition of trauma is not arbitrary. At its core, it is an attempt by the psyche to resolve what has been left unfinished. The soul repeats the pattern, not out of self-sabotage, but because it is trying to bring consciousness to the wound. It is attempting to complete the story, to make whole what has been fragmented. But without awareness, the repetition becomes suffering. The person may ask, why does this keep happening to me? Without realizing that the why is buried in the past, not just their own past, but the past of those who came before them. The work then is not simply to stop the behavior, but to understand its origin, to turn inward and uncover the inherited wound that drives the cycle. One of the most profound tools Jung offered for this work is the process of active imagination and dream analysis. Dreams, Jung believed, are the language of the unconscious. They carry symbols and messages from the parts of the psyche that the ego does not yet understand. A dream of being chased, of falling, of encountering a wounded child or a distant ancestor. These are not random images. They are clues to the emotional patterns that live within the individual. When interpreted with honesty and care, dreams can reveal the roots of trauma, the dynamics of complexes, and the unmet needs that drive repetitive behavior. They can also offer guidance toward healing, showing the way out of the pattern by presenting images of integration, support, and inner transformation. Inherited trauma also lives in the body. Jung's work has been echoed and expanded by somatic psychologists who recognize that the body holds the memory of trauma. Chronic tension, fatigue, digestive issues, and autoimmune disorders may all be linked to unresolved emotional energy. A person who carries generations of fear may live in a constant state of hypervigilance, unable to relax. One who carries ancestral grief may experience depression that has no identifiable source. These bodily symptoms are part of the same psychic pattern. They are the voice of the unconscious speaking through flesh and nerve. To heal these patterns, the work must include the body, the emotions, and the symbolic language of the psyche. Jung also emphasized the role of ritual and symbolic action in breaking trauma patterns. Because these patterns are embedded in the unconscious, they cannot always be addressed by logic or reason. The unconscious responds to image, emotion, and sacred meaning, creating rituals of release, speaking unspoken truths, writing letters that are never sent, honoring the ancestors, expressing grief through art or music. All of these are ways to engage the deeper layers of the psyche. The goal is not to erase the past, but to relate to it differently, to make space for healing by acknowledging what has been denied or forgotten. The individual who begins to recognize and confront their inherited trauma patterns is engaging in profoundly sacred work. They are not only healing themselves, they are interrupting a cycle that has likely been repeating for generations. Jung saw this as part of the collective responsibility of the individual. By becoming conscious, the individual contributes to the evolution of humanity. They reduce the burden on future generations. They create new possibilities where previously there were only repetitions. But this work requires immense courage. It involves facing pain that may not even be one's own, grieving losses that occurred before one was born, and forgiving what may never be apologized for. It is the work of deep soul transformation. Often, this journey is lonely. The culture does not always understand it, families may resist it, but Jung believed that individuation, the becoming of the true self, is the highest calling of the soul. And to individuate, one must face and integrate the unconscious. One must listen to the patterns, feel the emotions, and take responsibility for what lives within, even if it was inherited. In doing so, the individual becomes free, not free from the past, but free in relation to it. They are no longer driven by unseen forces but guided by conscious choice. The trauma may still echo, but it no longer defines them. The pattern may still whisper, but it no longer commands obedience. They become authors of their own lives, walking a path of authenticity, wholeness, and truth. Carl Jung believed that one of the most perilous signs in a person is the refusal to confront suffering as a transformative force, instead choosing to suppress, escape, or spiritually bypass it. In his view, suffering is not an obstacle to growth, it is the very medium through which the soul speaks. It is the fire that purifies, the crucible that forges meaning, and the passage through which one awakens to deeper consciousness. The ego, however, recoils from suffering. It seeks to avoid discomfort at all costs. It wants quick fixes, distractions, and spiritual ideals that promise peace without pain. Jung warned that when a person denies their suffering or masks it with shallow positivity, they do not avoid it, they bury it deeper into the unconscious, where it festers, grows, and eventually erupts in destructive or depressive patterns. The more a person avoids suffering, the more they become ruled by it from the shadows. This avoidance often takes the form of what Jungian psychologists call spiritual bypassing. A person uses spiritual beliefs, practices, or ideologies not as paths to depth, but as ways to escape the raw, unresolved emotions that suffering brings. They may repeat affirmations to drown out fear, meditate to suppress anger, or interpret every painful experience as merely an illusion to be transcended. Jung observed that true spirituality requires going through suffering, not around it. When someone clings to light without ever entering the dark, they develop a lopsided psyche. They become dissociated from their shadow, emotionally disconnected, and spiritually superficial. The path to wholeness is not made of bliss alone. It requires descent into the underworld of one's own pain, confusion, and contradiction. Suffering, unconsciously endured, initiates transformation. It strips away illusions, dismantles false identities, and reveals what truly matters. The person who allows themselves to feel deeply, who mourns, grieves, rages, and aches, discovers an inner resilience that cannot be accessed any other way. Jung likened this process to alchemy, the ancient art of transforming base matter into gold. In psychological terms, the base material is the raw suffering, and the gold is the expanded consciousness that emerges when suffering is integrated. This transformation does not occur through repression or denial. It happens when the person faces the pain with honesty, sits in the fire without fleeing, and allows the soul to do its slow, mysterious work beneath the surface of the ego's control. Many people mistake suffering as a sign that something has gone wrong. They believe it means they are failing, that they are weak, or that they must be doing something spiritually incorrect. But Jung saw suffering as a natural and necessary part of individuation. It is not the suffering itself that is dangerous, it is the refusal to find meaning within it. When suffering is stripped of meaning, it becomes unbearable. It feels random, cruel, and pointless. But when a person begins to ask, "What is this trying to show me?" or "What part of myself is being revealed through this pain?" the suffering becomes a teacher. It becomes a guide. It begins to serve a purpose greater than the immediate discomfort. Jung did not romanticize suffering. He did not suggest that people should seek it or wallow in it. Rather, he insisted that suffering must be met with consciousness, that it should be entered with awareness, supported with love, and honored for the initiation that it offers. In suffering, the ego is humbled. It is brought to its knees, stripped of its pretensions, and made vulnerable. This humility opens the door to the deeper self, to the archetypal dimensions of the psyche that the ego cannot access on its own. In this space of brokenness, the self begins to emerge not as an idea or belief, but as an experience. The person begins to feel something larger than themselves, moving through them, holding them, shaping them. One of the dangers of denying suffering is the hardening of the heart. When pain is not processed, it turns into bitterness, cynicism, or numbness. The person becomes disconnected from compassion not only for others, but for themselves. They build emotional walls, mistrust intimacy, and suppress vulnerability. Jung understood that the refusal to suffer is often the refusal to love. Love requires openness, and openness requires the willingness to feel. If one cannot feel pain, one cannot feel joy either. The heart becomes armored, and life loses its color. The person may appear functional, even successful, but they are spiritually dry. They are surviving, not living. Suffering also brings us into contact with the collective human condition. When we suffer, we are stripped of our masks and exposed to the universal experience of loss, fear, and mortality. This exposure can lead to profound empathy. Jung taught that the more a person has suffered consciously, the more they can hold space for the suffering of others without judgment. They do not need to fix, rescue, or minimize. They can simply be present, because they have been there. This kind of presence is healing. It breaks the illusion of isolation and connects us to something larger than ourselves. It awakens the archetype of the wounded healer, one who transforms their own suffering into a source of healing for others. In Jungian psychology, there is also the archetype of the dark night of the soul. This is not a mere depression or existential slump, it is a profound spiritual crisis, often triggered by the loss of meaning, identity, or direction. The dark night dismantles everything the ego has relied on. It feels like death, because in a symbolic sense, it is. The ego must die to allow the self to be born. Jung considered these periods sacred, though they are terrifying. They strip away all certainty and plunge the person into darkness. But if the individual can endure, if they can remain conscious and resist the urge to escape or numb, something new begins to grow. A deeper identity, a more authentic way of being, a soul-rooted life. The danger lies in pathologizing this darkness. Modern society often treats any form of psychological pain as something to be medicated, fixed, or eliminated. But Jung saw that some forms of suffering are not symptoms of illness, they are signs of growth. They are signals that the soul is demanding attention, that the old life is no longer viable, that something sacred is trying to be born. He encouraged therapists and seekers alike to respect the timing and rhythm of the psyche, not to rush healing, not to force enlightenment, but to trust the process. To descend consciously, knowing that the darkness is not the end, it is the beginning of transformation. Jung also warned against the spiritual ego that arises when a person uses their suffering to feel superior. The martyr complex, the wounded identity, the persona of the suffering saint, all of these are traps. True suffering does not inflate the ego, it humbles it. It does not separate us from others, it connects us more deeply. If a person clings to their pain as a badge of honor, they are still avoiding its deeper message. Suffering wants to move. It wants to be expressed, felt, released, and ultimately transmuted. But it can only do this if the person is willing to be honest about it, not perform it, not hide it, but meet it with sincerity and openness. The soul does not grow in comfort. It grows in fire. It grows when the old structures crumble, when the masks fall away, when the person is forced to face the truth about who they are and what they carry. Suffering brings us to this threshold. It brings us to the edge of what we thought we could bear, and then invites us to go deeper, not because we are being punished, but because we are being prepared for love, for wisdom, for purpose, for a life that is no longer defined by the ego's preferences, but shaped by the soul's longing. Suffering, consciously held, becomes the soil in which authenticity takes root. It is not the enemy of the soul. It is its awakening call.